Hey all, Martin with Modal Musical Machines here, and getting down to the final stuff. Got all the lacquer on this 1979 KM model Les Paul Standard, and it's the original tobacco burst that it used to have. Not original, I just put it on, but you know what I mean. Right, so doing some wet sanding now. I'm going to use 400 grit wet sanding and 800 wet sanding and 1500 just hand sanding it, and then I'll take it over to the buffer back there, and so I'm just going to get started here because going to try to have it ready by the end of today. We'll see. This shouldn't take very long though. The last few coats that I put on were like half-strength thinned out coats, so they lay down really nice and flat. The last few of them that I did, once I had built up some good, lacquer on the body. So essentially, in fact, I'm going to continue using the block for the back because it's a perfectly flat block, and this way I make sure that I have a perfectly flat back surface, which, yes, don't want to get the block too wet, so I'll just put the water directly on the body, and it's just a matter, all I want to do is get it leveled. That's all I'm really doing with this first thing with the 400 grit. It's just getting it leveled so there aren't any stipples or any low points or high points or anything else, which really shouldn't take very much on this at all, because as I say, it was like 50% lacquer, 50% thinner the last 3 coats that I put on, and did very light sanding in between all of those coats too, so it should be very little of this. Then I'll move on to the 800 grit, and then the 1500, just to get it ready for the buffer. And like that, I'll show you the next step as this develops. Hey, so still on the 400 grit, but I did want to show you just a little bit of the top. And now I've gone over to my fairly stiff and firm rubberized thingy. It's a rubber block. It's still fairly firm, but it has a little more flex than the straight block does, and obviously we've got a carved top, so it needs to get around a few curves and such without going through into the coat before. I don't want to fully remove the last coat. I just want to make sure in the 400 grit here, I'm just making sure that it's level. This actually has to be the most meticulous pass, because anything that this leaves is going to show times 10 once it's buffed and polished. So the surfaces have to be perfectly level and smooth, no stipples, no low spots, or anything like that. And then the subsequent passes with the 800 and then 1500 are merely, they're just removing the scratches that the previous grit left. Some of you guys know all this stuff. In fact, probably, well, I don't know. Anyway, I'm just talking. So there. On a new guitar, what I've kind of taken to doing lately is getting all the finish onto it first, but before the finish completely cures, I'll go ahead and do the routing then. because then there isn't any sanding around all of these edges and stuff like that. I don't have to worry about, you know, that kind of thing. You have a tendency to, like, you know, lose the flatness around all of these kinds of cavities and stuff like that, which is one of the things that makes this kind of job that much tougher, or just trickier. You just have to pay attention, because all of these areas you still have to get it level and flat, but you can't go into them, especially when I was doing the removal. Okay, that's enough of that. Right, so now we're on to the 800 grit, and even on the back I'm just using the rubber block now rather than, you know, the fixed wooden block, because all we're doing now, we're not doing leveling anymore. This is just you know, removing the scratch marks from the previous grit, 400 grit, and so it's pretty light sanding. It doesn't look any different than the last bunch, so there's not a whole lot to see except just understanding what you're doing at this point. So in fact, really trying to remove as little finish as possible, but this stuff is pretty aggressive. It's you know, good quality. I find that it really does the trick without putting a whole lot of pressure on it. I don't have to go over, you know, the areas over and over as I have to, you know, at the previous stage when I'm doing leveling. This is really just doing a nice even pass over it. And that's basically what that looks like. One thing also to remember about these, you know, last two stages, the really finer and finer grits of sandpaper, wet sanding, is that you want to make sure that there's no dust or anything that might be larger than the actual grains of this, because if there is, you're just putting new scratches in, and you have to go back and do it again, as I've discovered, much to my chagrin, way too often. So, you know, before doing this, I basically prepare my surface, get it all vacuumed up and cleaned up, brushed off and everything else, just to make sure that, you know, there's no dust on there or any grains of anything that might, you know, mess up what I'm doing at this point. Nice, clean, soft t-shirt. You know, I mean, the worst it's got out on it is some lint, and that's not going to harm anything at this point. I always have a tendency to kind of look sideways on it so I can see reflections off the surface, just in case there's some little thing. I also listen, because you can hear if there's some little thing scratching around in there, and at least catch yourself before you do too much more damage. If it starts squeaking or squealing, you know there's something in there that shouldn't be. So, right, one little detail. I like to use these rubber guys here to do things like getting close to the neck. Simple little tool, but it allows me to get right in there, right up to it. And doesn't take a lot. You don't want to put more pressure on it than you were putting on the rest of it. Otherwise, you'll actually see that in the, you know, the finish. And I also did that all around the neck, just in close to all of the little spots where, you know, things like a big old thing like this can't get to. But this is one area, just the face of the heel, or the butt of the heel of the neck, I don't know what you call it, but that's a little spot that sometimes gets neglected. and you can kind of see that nobody really bothered to level that little spot there for some strange reason. Okay, next. So I'm on the last bit of wet sanding, and this is a 1500 grit. A lot of guys don't do this. I just do because I don't like going backwards. When you have a really good buffing machine and get the total production finish, it shows everything, and So in fact, I use this is a film sandpaper. The film is super flat. It's made very flat so that this ridiculously fine grit sits down on it, way more level than you can possibly do on a paper type sandpaper. This is made for a reciprocal sander, as you can see. I don't like using those. I don't feel like I have the same control. I've had issues where it just burns through. It goes too fast for me. And at this stage of the game, I mean, the buffer is really fast, and that's nice. But at this stage of the game, I think slower is better. And I just like to do it by hand. I always feel like I have more control, and I've never had a situation where I, didn't get the result I wanted, and no burning through. And again, this is really just a light going over, because all I'm doing is removing the scratches from the 800 grit. I'm going around the edges. With this, I'm moving pretty quickly, but I am putting some pressure on it. With this grit, doing it by hand, you really have little or no chance of burning through or doing any damage. So I actually do a little bit more pressure on this last final wet sanding issue than I do on the two previous, just because it's so fine. It can be aggressive at that level, and it is. This is really pretty high quality stuff, but there's only so much, so much depth that a 1500 grit sandpaper can do anyway. So again, being very careful. In fact, what I did with this is I took this after the last grit, rinsed it all out, made sure that everything was all clean. Anything that was in there from the previous grit of sandpaper was gone, just to make sure that there was no little thingies. So this still has a very satin finish, even with that 1500. But I find from this stage going to the medium, medium polish on the buffer, it's just like boom, it's right there. It's so perfect. Anyway, on to the next thing.